We are starting this deep dive today with a question that, honestly, on the surface seems incredibly simple, but it cuts right to the absolute heart of what separates a silicon chip from a biological brain. A listener asked us, why does our brain need these massive decentralized units? And we're talking thousands of yes-no switches, just to understand something as simple as a spoon.
Yeah.
When a regular computer can just store that information instantly, it just needs one tiny centralized address.
It's such a great question because it immediately throws a spotlight on what we could call the great theoretical divide in the sciences of the mind.
A schism.
It's a total schism. We're not just comparing, two different kinds of hardware. We're looking at two fundamentally different philosophies of information. On one side, you have conventional computation, and on the other, you have biological cognition.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Because both systems, at their core, are using binary logic. It's all zeros and ones, yes or no. But the approaches they take are just polar opposites. You have the digital world, the Turing machine model, which is centralized, it's sequential, and it's brilliantly efficient.
It is.
And that efficiency, it comes from a really clever choice. It decouples its symbols from reality. It says, okay, the arbitrary string 0000 is going to mean spoon.
And that's the shortcut. That's the genius of it. The machine doesn't care one bit what 0000 means. It just knows the rules for moving it, for storing it, for comparing it. But the difficulty of cognition, the thing that makes it so complex, comes from the metabolic and the topological cost of completely rejecting that shortcut.
So the brain has to maintain those links.
It has to. It has to ground every single concept in sensory experience. Otherwise, that concept has zero intrinsic meaning for the organism. It's just noise.
So the listener's question, it really sets up our mission for this deep dive. We need to investigate why this seemingly inefficient, this exponentially scaling structure in the brain is not just, not just an option, but absolutely mandatory.
Exactly. It's not computational overkill. We're going to find that it's the mandatory price you pay to create real meaning, to get robustness, and this is critical, to maintain semantic clarity in a world that is incredibly messy and high-dimensional.
And we're going to tackle this by really focusing on why that decentralization is non-negotiable.
That's right. We'll break it down into, I think, three main parts. First, we'll try to decode the arithmetic of cognitive load, what that mysterious 16 operations for 4 possibilities number really means for logical thinking.
Okay.
Then we'll get into the symbol grounding problem, which is really the philosophical and architectural reason for having decentralized sensors. And finally, we'll look at the actual structures biology uses, going from that simple but flawed idea of a grandmother cell all the way to the vast, strange geometry of what we call sparse distributed representation.
Welcome to the deep dive. I'm Satosha.
And I'm Satoshi.
Okay. Let's jump right in then.
Let's do it.
The first thing that really stands out is this massive contrast in just retrieving a piece of data. You have the digital shortcut versus what you've called the biological burden. So when my computer needs the definition of spoon, it's pulling from RAM, from random access memory. How is that process fundamentally different?
Well, in a conventional computer, the cost to retrieve something from memory is constant. In computer science terms, they call it O1, as long as you know the address.
The address is key.
The address is everything. If the CPU knows the exact coordinate, the physical spot on the chip where the bits for spoon are sitting, it goes straight there. And it takes the same amount of time whether it's grabbing the word spoon or the entire Library of Congress.
Right. It's a pure act of fetching a coordinate. It doesn't need context. It doesn't need to understand anything.
It's the ultimate shortcut, like you said. It's like having a perfect GPS coordinate for a single grain of sand on a beach that stretches for miles. You don't look around. You don't compare it to other grains. You plug in the numbers and boom, there it is.
But the brain has nothing like that.
Nothing at all. There are no fixed memory addresses. The brain works on what we call content addressable memory. You don't find a memory by looking for location 4B7C. You find it by presenting a similar pattern of information.
So identification in the brain isn't fetching a coordinate. It's more like a matching game.
It's a problem of discrimination. You have to discriminate against all other possibilities through logical evaluation. The system has to actively search, it has to verify the content, and it has to resolve this deep, deep ambiguity every single time you think of something.
So if my brain sees a shiny piece of metal cutlery on the table, It's not just looking up shiny metal thing. It's internally running this whole series of tests. Like,
Yes.
is it a fork? No. Is it a knife? No. It's like a massive parallel internal game of 20 questions instead of just looking something up in a filing cabinet.
That's a perfect analogy. And that very requirement for internal logical evaluation, that is what drives the exponential scaling our listener picked up on.
Which brings us to that fascinating, very specific number that was in the source material. 16 operations for 4 possibilities. Now, at first glance, that sounds like some abstract test from a computer science textbook.
Right.
But you're saying it relates directly to the cost of achieving logical mastery in a cognitive system.
It's incredibly specific because it comes right out of the foundational combinatorial properties of binary logic. So let's just imagine the simplest possible little universe of concepts we can define. Let's say it only involves 2 binary variables. We'll call them P and Q.
Okay.
Let's say we're trying to define a simple object. Let P be the proposition, is it metal? Yes or no. And let Q be the proposition, is it concave? Yes or no.
So if both of those are binary, just yes or no, then that gives us 4 distinct possible states.
Right, exactly 4. You have 1, true and true, so it's metal and concave. 2, true and false, so it's metal, but not concave.
Like a knife blade.
A knife blade? Good. 3, false and true, so not metal, but concave, maybe a plastic ladle. And 4, false and false, neither metal nor concave. So 4 distinct possibilities in that tiny corner of reality.
Okay, that makes sense. But why 16 operations? Why isn't it just 4 operations, 1 for each state?
Because to achieve true cognitive mastery of that little space, the system can't just recognize the 4 states. It has to be able to define and recognize and manipulate the relationships between those 4 states in every single conceivable way.
Ah, so it's about the connections between
It's
them.
all about the connections. And that number 16, it's mathematically derived. It's 2 to the power of n, where n is our 2 variables. These 16 operations represent the full toolkit of logical connectives you need to completely characterize the relationship between P and Q, not just say that they exist.
So this is going way beyond the simple A and D or R not Rio gates that we learn about in basic logic.
Oh, way beyond. I mean, the 16 includes those, of course. P and DQ is one of them. It is both metal A and D concave. PRRQ is another.
Right.
It's either metal or it's concave. It also includes the trivial ones, like always true or always false.
Right.
But crucially, it includes the much more complex and cognitively very demanding operations. Things like XOR one or the other, but not both. And most importantly, logical implication.
Logical implication.
Yeah.
That feels like where the real cognitive heavy lifting begins.
It really is. I mean, think about the statement, if it is metal, then it must be concave. That's a rule. That's an implication.
Okay.
To be able to assert that rule, the cognitive system has to be able to actively exclude the one case where that rule is broken. The case where the premise is true, but the conclusion is false. The P is true and Q is false as state.
The metal knife blade.
It's a metal knife blade. Your system must be structurally capable of finding that specific combination and generating a hard no for it.
Right.
And that requires its own dedicated logical architecture. It's a specific operation.
And if we look at that whole set of 16, they cover every possible angle. Like, there's another operation that says it is metal but not concave.
And that's a distinct logical configuration. Your brain has to have the architecture to tell that state apart from the other 15 possibilities. If it can't, then the meaning of metal and concave is inherently fuzzy, it's ambiguous.
The ability to say yes to one thing depends on having the structure to say no to the 50 other ways things could have been.
Precisely. And this is where it gets really, really interesting because it connects this abstract math directly to human cognitive development. The sources link this demand for combinatorial logic right to the work of Jean Piaget.
The developmental psychologist.
That's the one. Piaget identified the mastery of these 16 binary propositional operations as the definitive cognitive line in the sand. It separates what he called concrete operational thought, which is how children tend to reason from formal adult cognition, which usually kicks in during adolescence.
So what's the practical difference? What can a teenager do that a young child can't, that requires mastering this whole logical toolkit?
Well, the classic example is the ability to do science, to isolate variables. Take Piaget's famous pendulum problem. You show someone a pendulum, and you ask them to figure out what determines how fast it swings. Is it the length of the string? Is it the weight on the end? Or is it how hard you push it?
A younger, concrete thinker might just start trying things randomly. They'll change the weight and push it harder at the same time. They don't have a system.
Exactly. To solve it properly, you have to implicitly use this entire logical lattice. You have to understand and test combinations like, if I change the length and I hold the weight constant q, then the period changes r. But you also have to understand the negation. It is not the case that length changes and weight is constant.
You have to be able to isolate one factor while controlling for all the others.
Which requires using complex logical operations like non-implication and exclusion. That ability to control for the 15 alternative possibilities is what lets you zero in on the one true causal link.
So this exponential scaling isn't just some number for a computer science problem. It's literally the price of understanding cause and effect. It's the cost of moving from just seeing things happen to actually thinking scientifically.
It is the structural cost of being certain. The system doesn't just store a fact like metal plus concave. It embodies the entire logical framework needed to distinguish that one state from all the other ways those two features could possibly be related.
And that logical complexity just snowballs, doesn't it? Even if we move beyond relationships and just look at the simple act of deciding which concept we're looking at. This brings us to a second kind of complexity, this idea of quadratic scaling, the ON squared cost.
Right, and this is all about inhibition. In the brain, getting a clear, unambiguous decision, what neuroscientists call a winner-take-all outcome, is absolutely a paramount for survival. If you correctly identify a spoon, that concept neurologically can't be allowed to coexist with fork and knife and ladle all firing at the same strength.
It would be chaos. You'd be paralyzed by indecision.
Total chaos. So the concept that's being identified doesn't just have to fire a yes signal for itself. It has to actively shout down or inhibit every other competing concept that might be confused with it.
So for every yes, there are thousands of no's.
Potentially thousands. If you have, say, N competing concepts in your mind to guarantee a clean win for just one of them, that winner has to send an inhibitory, a shut-up signal, to all N-1 of its competitors.
And that means the number of connections required for this just explodes.
It scales quadratically. For N concepts, you need N times N1 inhibitory connections.
That's a staggering physical and metabolic cost. So just make that concrete for you listening. If my brain has a vocabulary of just 100 distinct concepts, we're already talking about roughly 10,000 inhibitory connections, just to make sure I don't get the mix-up.
10,000 connections just for inhibition, and if you scale that up to the maybe 10,000 distinct concepts an adult knows, you're looking at nearly 100 million connections.
Wow.
It's the metabolic price of certainty, and it's a huge point of difference from a digital computer. On a silicon chip, the memory cells you're not using are just inert. They use almost no power.
Right.
In the brain, the operations aren't just the firing of the correct neuron, the yes. It's the simultaneous, active burning of energy to silence thousands of incorrect neurons, all the no's. This negative information processing is what gives us semantic clarity, and it's a huge reason the brain is such an energy hog.
This sounds like an immediate, powerful evolutionary pressure that would force the brain away from any kind of simple one-to-one coding. This must be what's called the curse of dimensionality.
It is. It absolutely is. If we tried to build a brain using the simplest possible approach, what's called localist units, where one neuron is dedicated to one specific object, the combination of that logical complexity and the need for all this inhibition just becomes unsustainable almost immediately.
The number of units you'd need would grow exponentially, right? The $2 are with the number of features?
Exactly. Let's take that visual scene example from the sources. It's a great illustration. Imagine you want to represent a visual scene, not with millions of colors, but with just 20 simple, independent, binary features.
Okay, like, is there a vertical edge? Is something moving? Is the color red? Just 20 yes-no questions.
Just 20 simple checks. Now, to cover every possible unique scene that could be defined by those 20 features using a simple localist coding scheme, you would need 2 to the power of 20 distinct detectors.
Which is over 1 million.
Over 1 million dedicated detectors, just for 20 simple binary features. Now imagine a real-world object, like a car, which has hundreds of relevant features. The number of detectors you'd need explodes into the trillions, far beyond the 86 billion neurons the entire human brain even has.
So that kind of simple one neuron per idea system is it's a non-starter. It's biologically impossible.
It's completely impossible. And this overwhelming combinatorial explosion is the critical pressure that forces biology to abandon that centralized localist coding.
So to circle back to the listener's question, the need for exponential units is validated right there. The massive structure is required simply because the number of possible ways features can combine in the real world is astronomical.
Biology is forced toward decentralized, distributed representations just to manage the raw feature space, even if you only ever use a tiny fraction of that space in your lifetime.
That vast structural apparatus is the foundation. That's the stage you have to build to support the high-dimensional logic we need to create meaning.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've established the cost, both metabolic and structural, that's needed just to manage the logic. Now let's get to the core philosophical and architectural question of this deep dive. Why is decentralization absolutely required to create intrinsic meaning?
This really starts with what we could call the crisis of arbitrary symbols. As we said at the top, conventional computing is so powerful because its symbols, that 0000 that stands for spoon, are completely arbitrary.
Their meaning is extrinsic. It's assigned by a programmer with a lookup table outside the system.
Precisely. The computer is a system that is a master of manipulating syntax, the shape of the symbol, the value, the rules for how to move it around. But it possesses zero semantic access. It doesn't know what it's doing.
This is the core of John Searle's famous Chinese room argument, isn't it? The person inside the room can follow a rule book perfectly to manipulate Chinese symbols. They get one set of squiggles, look up the rule, and pass out another set of squiggles.
And to an outside observer, it looks like the room understands Chinese.
But the person inside has no idea what any of it means. They don't understand a word of Chinese.
The conclusion being that syntax alone is not enough for meaning. And this leads us straight to the symbol grounding problem, which was formalized by Stephen Harnad. The argument is, for any system to have genuine cognition, its internal symbols can't be arbitrary. They have to be grounded in the system's own sensory and motor experience of the real world.
They have to be tied back to the physical reality they represent.
They have to be.
Okay, the symbols must be grounded in reality. I get that. But why does that grounding, specifically, demand a decentralized architecture? Why can't a big, powerful, centralized system just take in all the sensory input?
Because the interface with reality is itself inherently decentralized. The world doesn't arrive at our senses neatly packaged as a symbolic string that says S-P-O-N.
Right.
It arrives as a massive, high-dimensional, distributed flood of raw data.
What's a good way to picture that decentralized sensor array?
Just think about the human eye. The retina itself contains something like 100 million photoreceptors. Every single one of them is a decentralized yes-no unit. It's actively detecting light intensity at one specific coordinate in space.
So that's 100 million individual assertions being made all at once. It's not one single input stream.
It's a decentralized geometry of light and shadow, and so meaning, therefore, isn't something you retrieve from a central database. It's something that is constructed bottom-up based on the consensus of all these decentralized assertions.
So the concept of a spoon isn't fetched. You're saying it's assembled on the fly.
It's assembled from the simultaneous yes votes from multiple spatially separated feature detectors. A curvature detector fires over here, a metallic texture detector fires over there, a detector that recognizes a specific kind of graspable shape fires.
And if we tried to force all of that rich, high-dimensional input, that consensus from 100 million sensors, through a single centralized bottleneck, like a traditional CPU, what would happen?
You'd run headfirst into a compression crisis. You would have to take that rich geometry of the sensory experience and instantly compress it down into some arbitrary low-dimensional symbol. You'd be back to the integer 42 or the string 0000.
You'd strip all the inherent meaning out of it. You'd be right back to just syntax.
You'd be right back to the Chinese room. Decentralization is structurally necessary to preserve the richness and complexity that you need to assemble meaning in the first place.
This distinction between centralized compression and decentralized assembly, it also really clarifies this idea of intrinsic intentionality. In a centralized system, the meaning isn't in the machine, is it?
It's always external. The meaning is imposed by the designer, by the human who wrote the code. And this is what philosophers sometimes call the homunculus fallacy, the idea that there's a little person inside the machine who's looking at the symbols and interpreting them, doing all the semantic heavy lifting.
A centralized system is only meaningful to an outside observer.
Exactly. But a decentralized system allows meaning to emerge from within the system itself. It allows for what we call intrinsic intentionality.
So when that very specific, very complex pattern of decentralized yes-no units fires in my brain in response to seeing a spoon, that pattern is the meaning.
That pattern is the meaning for the system. And that pattern is defined not by some external lookup table, but by its topological relationship to all the other patterns stored in the system's memory. The spoon pattern is physically close in the brain's state space to the ladle pattern, but it's topologically miles away from the cat pattern.
And that relational meaning doesn't need an external interpreter.
It is its own meaning. And this gets at a crucial difference between a computer bit and a cognitive unit. A bit in a computer is just passive storage, a flip-flop. But what makes a cognitive yes-no unit active?
What is it doing?
The cognitive unit isn't just passively storing a 1 or a 0, it's actively asserting a proposition about the environment. It doesn't just register 1, it asserts, yes, there is a vertical edge right here at this specific orientation, or yes, this surface I'm seeing is reflective and smooth. Each unit is contributing an active assertion to the emergent meaning.
So the 10,000 decentralized units that might represent a concept aren't just redundant storage bits. They are 10,000 simultaneous active assertions that, when you combine them, define the concept.
Exactly. And that shift in thinking from passive storage to active assertion is one of the key differentiators between computation and cognition.
And beyond the pure semantics of it, this sheer volume of decentralized units gives an organism something absolutely essential for survival. Robustness. The ability to degrade gracefully.
Yes, this is the practical evolutionary payoff for that enormous exponential unit count. Centralized architectures are fundamentally brittle. They're fragile.
Right.
If that one single centralized memory address that holds the definition for spoon gets corrupted, maybe a cosmic ray flips a bit, or there's a tiny hardware failure, the concept is just gone. It's irrevocably lost. It's a catastrophic failure.
But because biological concepts are spread out, distributed across thousands of units, the system can avoid that kind of catastrophic crash.
It relies on massive redundancy and distribution. If the concept spoon is encoded in a pattern of activity that's spread across, say, 1,000 neurons out of a population of 1 million, what happens if 50 of those 1,000 neurons die or they misfire?
The remaining 950 still form a pattern that's highly recognizable. The network can essentially fill in the blanks, right? It's a process called auto-association.
It can reconstruct the missing information. The concept degrades gracefully. You might hesitate for a second or briefly misidentify the spoon as a label, but the concept itself isn't destroyed. It just becomes a little bit fuzzier.
So the exponential number of units is really a biological insurance policy.
It is. It provides the massive redundancy and stability you absolutely have to maintain accurate, reliable function in a messy, probabilistic world where your cells are constantly dying and your sensory input is always noisy.
It's a really profound trade-off then, isn't it? The incredible efficiency of a conventional computer is directly tied to how fragile it is.
Yes.
And at the same time, the metabolic inefficiency of the brain, driven by this massive decentralized redundancy, is the ultimate source of its robustness and its adaptability.
That's a powerful way to frame it. But we should probably push back on that idea of inefficiency a little. Isn't that enormous energy cost, the fact that the brain uses 20% of the body's energy while being only 2% of its mass? Isn't that a fragility in itself? How does biology justify that cost?
That's a really critical question. I think the justification has to lie in the payoff of that energy expenditure. The cost is justified because the output is meaning and ultimately survival. A computer that crashes catastrophically is worthless in the wild. A system that can maintain 95% functional accuracy, even when under biological stress, has a huge evolutionary advantage.
So the energy isn't just being spent on storage.
Not at all. It's being spent on continuously maintaining those logical distinctions and those millions of inhibitory connections we talked about. It's the cost of the active processing that's required for semantic certainty and resilience.
So the high metabolic cost is the price of keeping all your concepts separate and robust. It's the price of ensuring high fidelity, meaning in a low fidelity biological environment.
Okay, so we've established that the complexity of logic demands this exponential scaling, and the necessity of meaning demands decentralization. So now we have to ask the practical question. How did the brain actually structure itself to manage all this exponential complexity while still keeping concepts separate? Let's start with the simplest possible approach first. The so-called grandmother cell.
The grandmother cell hypothesis is, well, it's an elegant idea, even if it turns out to be a bit naive. It posits a purely localist representation. The idea is that there is a single dedicated neuron in your brain that responds exclusively to one incredibly complex object, say your actual grandmother's face.
Or, in the famous modern example, a picture of the actress Jennifer Aniston, seen from any angle.
Right. And the evidence for this, found in a part of the brain called the medial temporal lobe, is pretty remarkable. The sources talk about these concept cells that show this extreme selectivity. A single neuron might fire only when a patient sees a picture of a specific celebrity, or hears their name, or reads their name, regardless of the format.
So it does seem like high-level cognition converges on these very specific binary yes-no identification points.
It does. It suggests there's a final, high-level cognitive unit that has successfully mastered all 16 of those logical operations needed to distinguish, say, Aniston from every other person in the universe. And this convergence gives you a really simple, easy-to-read output.
But if these concept cells are the final readout, why can't they also be the storage medium?
Yeah.
Why is a purely localist system where every idea has one cell a catastrophic failure for an architecture as big as the brain?
It takes us right back to the curse of dimensionality and that combinatorial explosion. If you actually needed a dedicated cell for every single possible combination of features and concepts and viewpoints and context you might ever encounter.
Like a spoon in low light, a spoon that's partially hidden, a plastic spoon, a bent spoon.
Exactly. The number of neurons you would need would instantly exceed the hardware capacity of the brain. You'd run out of neurons before you could even cover a tiny fraction of the objects an average person interacts with every single day.
That 1 million detectors for just 20 simple features.
That's the one. If the brain stored concepts only using grandmother cells, we'd be bankrupt. So neuroscientists now understand these incredible concept cells not as the centralized storage unit, but as the final highly compressed output signal of a much deeper, vastly more distributed process that's happening across thousands of other neurons.
So we need an architecture that can use a limited number of neurons to encode an exponentially larger number of unique patterns.
And that necessity for huge encoding capacity with limited physical parts pushes us directly to the biological solution, what's called parallel distributed processing, or PDP.
Where meaning is encoded in a pattern of activity across a whole population of units, not in a single unit.
This is the fundamental structural shift. If you have n binary units, a localist system can only store n distinct concepts, one for each unit.
Right.
But a distributed system, where concepts are represented by patterns, can theoretically represent up to 2 to the power of n items. The capacity problem is solved by moving from addressing specific locations to identifying unique patterns.
But that solution immediately creates its own problem, the trade-off we mentioned earlier, interference.
Yes.
Since concepts like spoon and fork share a lot of features, they're both metal, they have handles, they're cutlery, their distributed patterns must share some of the same active neurons.
And that shared real estate causes the critical problem of catastrophic interference. If you learn a new feature about spoons, say you learn about a rare type of ceremonial spoon, that learning process might accidentally alter the connections, the synapses that are also being used by the fork pattern.
And suddenly you forget something critical about forks.
The new learning overwrites the old. This interference makes the system unstable and unreliable.
So the brain absolutely must maintain semantic separability. It has to keep the concept of spoon distinct enough from fork to guarantee the 100% accuracy our listener was asking about. How does using high dimensions fix this interference problem?
It's a geometric solution. You achieve what's called orthogonalization. Think about it like this. Imagine trying to keep 100 pins separate from each other, but they're all stuck on a small tabletop. They're going to touch, they'll inevitably collide.
Sure.
But now imagine you could project those 100 pins into a massive high-dimensional space. Imagine a 10,000-dimensional hyperroom. In that vast space, even very similar concepts like spoon and fork can be physically pulled far, far apart from each other.
So the exponential increase in physical units, the sheer vastness of the brain's structure, is actually the architecture you need to create enough geometric space so that concepts don't bump into each other and interfere.
That is precisely it. And this absolute necessity for massive structural volume leads us to the dominant model for how the cortex codes information. Sparse distributed representations, or SDRs.
That's
This
right.
is the synthesis. It's the way you get both high capacity and low interference. The idea is that it uses massive dimensionality, say a vector with 10,000 units or more, but it maintains extreme sparsity.
And sparsity just means that at any given moment, only a very, very small percentage of those 10,000 units are actually active. Maybe only 2% or 3% are firing a yes.
And that combination is just genius. The massive dimensionality gives you the geometric separation you need to prevent interference, the orthogonality. And the extreme sparsity ensures that the specific 2% pattern for spoon is unique and almost completely non-overlapping with the 2% pattern for almost every other concept.
But it still encodes similarity.
It does. If the SDRs for spoon and fork share, say, 50% of their active bits, then they are physically, topologically, 50% similar in the brain's representational space.
It's such a different philosophy. A computer uses dense binary strings, like 011011111, to maximize the amount of information you can cram into a small space.
Right.
But cognition does the opposite. It uses sparse binary activity across a massive structure to maximize the clarity of semantic meaning through spatial geometry.
That's a perfect summary, and it completely validates the listener's initial insight. You need the exponential units to support the sparsity and the semantic clarity that comes with it.
So to take this from a biological hypothesis to something with more rigorous mathematical backing, we have to look at the work of Pentti.
Yes, his work on sparse distributed memory, or SDM. Canerva's model treats long-term memory retrieval as an act of navigation inside an enormous binary address space. Imagine a space that's maybe 1,000 bits wide.
A 1,000-dimensional Boolean space. A space that vast is almost entirely empty.
It is astronomically vast. I mean, there are 2 to the power of 1,000 possible memory addresses in that space. That's more than the number of atoms in the known universe. Human cognition is just navigating this impossibly huge geometry, and we only ever explore a tiny, tiny fraction of it.
And crucially, his model is content addressable, like we discussed. It's not like RAM.
Right, you don't need the exact 1,000-bit address to find the memory you're looking for.
So if I present the system with a noisy pattern, say my memory of the spoon is a little incomplete or distorted, the system can still find its way to the correct, clear concept.
It can. The system essentially measures the distance between your noisy input pattern and all the concepts it has stored, and it pulls out the one that's nearest. But this is where the structural cost really comes in, through what's called the tiling problem.
Okay, the tiling problem.
Yeah.
This implies that the physical architecture of the brain, the number of neurons, has to be large enough to properly cover this huge conceptual space.
That's it exactly. To make sure that any potential thought pattern you could have, no matter how noisy or approximate it is close enough to at least one physical storage location to be retrieved. The physical substrate, the cognitive units, or what Canerva called hard locations, they have to effectively tile this high-dimensional hypersphere.
If the space is too vast and the physical neurons are spread too thin, my thought about a bent, shiny cutlery thing might just drift around in the empty space between stored concepts and fail to converge on the memory of spoon.
And retrieval fails. Canerva showed mathematically that to get reliable coverage of this enormous high-dimensional space, the number of physical storage locations has to be extremely large. For a 1,000-bit address space, you need exponentially more physical locations than you could ever possibly store in a low-dimensional world.
So it's another direct validation. The vast structure is necessary to manage high-dimensional proximity. The exponential number of units is the price of geometric coverage, making sure every thought can be grounded and retrieved.
Right. And those same units, that same structure, supports the complex logical operations we need through what are called vector symbolic architectures, or VSA, sometimes called hyperdimensional computing.
VSA provides the actual algebra for how these 10,000-bit sparse patterns, which we can now call hypervectors, can be manipulated to create new meaning.
That's right. In VSA, the concept spoon isn't a passive address anymore. It's an active, high-dimensional hypervector.
And new meaning is generated by performing mathematical operations on these massive vectors. For example, how would you create a general concept like cutlery?
You do that through an operation called superposition. You would take the hypervector for spoon, and you would mathematically superimpose it or combine it with the hypervectors for fork and knife. The resulting hypervector for cutlery is a kind of probabilistic blend of all three. And this requires manipulating all 10,000 bits in parallel.
And to go beyond just generalizing, to compose features into a specific concept, that's an operation called binding.
Binding is where the system does these complex logical assignments. You'd take the hypervector that represents the feature shape, and you'd bind it using a specific mathematical operation with the hypervector for round. Then you take material and bind it with metal. And then you superimpose those results, shape bound with round, plus material bound with metal equals spoon.
And what's really crucial here is that these operations, binding and superposition, are fundamentally non-local and parallel.
Completely. In a traditional computer, if you add two numbers or perform a logic gate, That's a localized serial operation happening in one tiny part of the CPU. In VSA, performing the minding operation involves an action that simultaneously transforms or manipulates all 10,000 bits of the hypervector at once.
That requires a massive, decentralized, parallel architecture. The units have to be decentralized because the operations that create meaning are spread out across the entire geometry of the system. They're not isolated in a single core.
It's a complete reversal of architectural philosophy. Centralized computing says, keep the data small and local and process it one step at a time, serially.
And Cognition says, make the structure vast and decentralized, and process everything globally and all at once in parallel.
And that structural choice is forced on it by the absolute requirement that every concept has to be both grounded in reality and robust enough to survive the noise of a biological system.
So, after all that, what does this all mean? We started this deep dive just by asking why the brain needs these massive, decentralized structures to understand something as simple as a spoon when a computer can do it instantly.
And we followed that question down the rabbit hole. We found that the entire cost is structural, and it's driven by a whole series of non-negotiable requirements. First, the price of achieving logical mastery, of really understanding the relationships between concepts, is having the capacity to manage all 16 of those distinct logical operations.
The very thing Piaget identified as the threshold for formal adult thought.
Exactly. And we discovered that decentralization is structurally mandatory because intrinsic meaning, the only way to solve the symbol grounding problem, can only be assembled bottom-up from a vast distributed sensory array.
Which then gives the system both that intrinsic intentionality and the essential robustness it needs to survive failure by degrading gracefully.
And the final architecture that emerges, the sparse distributed representation, is the necessary high-dimensional solution you need to manage the combinatorial explosion and that curse of dimensionality. The divergence couldn't be clearer.
Computing is efficient because it handles arbitrary symbols efficiently in a small centralized space.
While cognition is metabolically expensive because it uses these vast, decentralized, sparse, high-dimensional geometries to ground its symbols in reality, which is the only way to ensure clarity, stability, and ultimately survival.
The exponential units aren't overkill at all. They are the exact price of accurate, reliable, and semantically clear meaning. It really forces you to reconsider what simple even means.
It does. I mean, if the capacity to just manage the relationships between two binary features, metal and concave, requires 16 distinct logical operations embedded in a quadratic inhibitory architecture.
Yeah.
Just imagine the structural requirements, the sheer number of decentralized yes-no assertions that are needed to manage something truly complex and abstract, like the meaning of the word justice.
That's a concept that isn't stored at any physical address. It's defined entirely by its incredibly complex, high-dimensional, sparsely active relationship to thousands of other hypervectors in your brain. Fairness, equity, law, punishment, mercy.
The meaning of justice is the topology of the neural patterns that define it, which means the structural architecture of your brain is literally the geometry of your philosophy and your moral reasoning. It's a structure built from the ground up to manage relational complexity in the most robust way possible.
That is fascinating. It leaves you with this profound realization that complexity in biology isn't a flaw to be engineered out. That complexity is simply what's required to achieve reliability and deep intrinsic meaning in a high-dimensional probabilistic world.
And that's a geometry worth exploring.
Until next time, keep digging.